In the 1930s, Saudi Arabia wasn't a kingdom of glass towers and sovereign wealth, it was a harsh stretch of sand, heat, and hunger. No skylines. No supercars. No futuristic megacities teased on glossy renderings. Just scattered tribes, fragile unity, and a treasury so thin that a bad season could mean empty shelves and unpaid soldiers. Now snap forward to 2026. The same desert state can move global energy markets with a few sentences and a few valves. Its national investment fund shows up everywhere, from buying a Premier League club to writing multi-billion-dollar checks in sports, tech, and entertainment. It can bankroll a ski resort in the sand as if physics were negotiable. And when oil prices jump or supply tightens, presidents, CEOs, and central bankers all start watching Riyadh. So how did a place that once survived on pilgrim fees become a country with the leverage to rattle economies half a world away? They found oil, is the lazy answer. Plenty of countries found oil. Very few turned it into durable power. The real story is about timing, bargaining, and control, how Saudi Arabia learned to convert a resource into a strategic weapon. And then into a global financial machine. Before oil, Saudi Arabia didn't function like a modern national economy. It was a newly unified kingdom stitched together from tribal loyalties, harsh geography, and a ruler who had won power through war. There were no factories feeding exports, no diversified tax base, and no meaningful state institutions built around production. If the country had an industry, it was survival, and the closest thing to stable revenue came from faith. Every year, pilgrims traveled to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. That movement of people created an entire ecosystem: lodging, food, transport, basic trade, and the fees tied to services and access. For a kingdom with little else to monetize, pilgrimage was the rare cash engine that connected the desert to the wider world. It wasn't wealth in the modern sense, but it was predictable enough to keep the state breathing. Then the Great Depression hit. What began as a financial collapse in the United States spread outward and froze global demand, commerce, and travel. In hard times, long-distance journeys become luxuries. Pilgrim flows thinned, and the kingdom's most reliable income stream dried up fast. With revenue collapsing, the government couldn't maintain basic functions, paying obligations, importing essentials, or stabilizing the fragile political order that had only recently been consolidated. That's the key context people miss when they jump straight to oil. Saudi Arabia didn't invest its way into petroleum from a position of strength. It was cornered. The early 1930s weren't the preface to a success story, they were a crisis. And that crisis forced the kingdom into a high-stakes gamble with foreign partners, because without a new source of money, there might not have been a state left to inherit any oil at all. By 1933, the Saudi treasury was running on fumes. The collapse in pilgrimage revenue didn't just mean austerity, it meant existential risk. A young state with weak institutions and a harsh environment can't survive long without cash. So King Abdulaziz made a choice that would look, at the time, less like strategy and more like desperation. He turned to foreign oil companies willing to gamble on a blank spot on the geological map. An American firm, Standard Oil of California, stepped in with an offer. In exchange for exploration and drilling rights over a vast territory, the kingdom would receive an upfront payment and the promise of future rents and royalties if oil was found. The headline number was small by the standards of what Saudi Arabia would later become, but in 1933 it mattered because it bought time. It kept the government afloat, kept imports moving, and kept the political project of unification from collapsing under financial stress. In a sense, the king was selling a claim on the future to pay for the present. From the company's perspective, this was a long shot. Drilling in the Arabian desert meant brutal heat, logistics nightmares, and the possibility that the entire venture would end as an expensive mistake. And for years, it did look like a mistake. Crews drilled well after well into stubborn rock. The work was slow, the costs piled up, and the results were humiliating: dry holes. One failure can be written off. Multiple failures start to look like a verdict. Back in the United States, executives began to question whether the desert was simply empty. The temptation to cut losses grew stronger with each unsuccessful attempt. By the late 1930s, the project was close to being abandoned. If that decision had been made, Saudi Arabia might have remained a poor, fragile kingdom for decades longer, or fractured under the pressures of scarcity. Then came the moment that rewrote the century. In 1938, at Dammam, the seventh well finally struck oil in commercially meaningful quantities. Not a symbolic trickle, but a flow that signaled a reservoir worth developing. It was the pivot point between a state that survived on pilgrimage fees and a state that could one day finance modern power. But even here, the story doesn't become a fairy tale overnight. The discovery was real, yet the control was not. The machinery, the expertise, the capital, and the operating decisions still belonged to the Americans. Saudi Arabia had found oil, but it hadn't yet found the leverage that oil could create. That leverage would be built later, slowly, through bargaining, patience, and a clear lesson: a resource is not power until you control how it moves. The first barrels didn't turn Saudi Arabia into a rich country overnight, because discovering oil is not the same as owning the oil business. In the early years, the kingdom sat on the resource, but the real power lived elsewhere, in the contracts, the technology, and the people who knew how to pull crude out of the ground, move it across oceans, and sell it into global markets. The concession agreements were written in an era when Western oil companies treated the Middle East like a giant gas station. They controlled exploration, drilling, pipelines, shipping, refining, and the commercial networks that connected producers to buyers. Local governments typically received a fixed payment up front and then royalties or rents that looked meaningful on paper but were small compared to the profits generated across the full value chain. Saudi Arabia got income, yes, but most of the upside flowed outward, into corporate balance sheets and banks far from the Gulf. And the dependency went deeper than money. The engineers, the managers, the equipment, the data, the logistics, nearly every critical link was imported and operated by foreigners. That meant the kingdom couldn't simply take over without risking a shutdown. If the operators walked away, pumps could stop, exports could freeze, and the new lifeline could vanish. So Saudi Arabia faced a reality that many resource states encounter. You can have the world's most valuable commodity beneath your feet and still be a junior partner in your own future. This is why the early oil era was a paradox. Oil created the possibility of wealth, but it also created a trap. Dependence on a foreign-run system that delivered revenue while quietly locking away control. Saudi Arabia's later rise wasn't just about pumping more crude. It was about learning how to move from royalty receiver to decision maker, how to climb from the bottom of the value chain to the top. Until the switch that mattered most sat in Riyadh's hands. Saudi Arabia's most important move wasn't finding oil, it was reclaiming control over it. And they did it the opposite way Iran tried. In 1951, Iran nationalized its oil industry in a single dramatic stroke, and the backlash was immediate: embargo pressure, financial strangulation, political destabilization. Riyadh watched that episode closely and took away a blunt lesson: if you try to rip the steering wheel out of a superpower's hands, they may wreck the whole car just to stop you from driving. So Saudi Arabia chose a slow, legal, negotiated takeover: death by paperwork. The first milestone was the 1950 50-50 profit-sharing arrangement with Aramco. It didn't appear out of nowhere. Across the producing world, governments were demanding a fairer split, and Saudi Arabia signaled, quietly but clearly, that if the deal didn't improve, they could follow the same nationalization path others were flirting with. In the Cold War context, Washington had reasons to prefer compromise over chaos. The result was a new baseline: half the profits to the kingdom, not just royalties. A seemingly technical shift, but it transformed the state's fiscal capacity and bargaining power. Behind the scenes, a second mechanism made the transition easier: U.S. tax policy. The payments Aramco made to Saudi Arabia could be treated as foreign taxes, reducing the incentive for the company to resist the new split. This is how power often changes hands in the real world, not with speeches, but with incentives that make resistance expensive and cooperation rational. Still, Saudi Arabia wasn't ready to run the machine alone. The oil system was a complex organism: reservoir management, drilling schedules, pipelines, shipping, and marketing networks. Pulling the plug too early could have shut down production and destroyed the very revenue the kingdom was trying to expand. So Riyadh paired money with patience, build capacity, train people, expand state expertise, and tighten leverage step by step. That patience paid off in the 1970s. Instead of storming the gates, Saudi Arabia began buying the company itself. In 1973, it purchased 25% of Aramco. A year later, that stake rose to 60%. And by 1980, the process reached its endpoint. Saudi Arabia acquired full ownership, compensating shareholders under negotiated terms rather than expropriating them overnight. The Americans didn't vanish, they stayed as contractors and technical partners, but the owner changed, and that was everything. Because ownership meant control, and control meant power. From that point on, Saudi Arabia wasn't merely collecting checks. It could decide how much oil to pump, when to pump it, and how to respond to global shocks. It could open the taps to flood the market or tighten supply to raise prices. What looked like an internal corporate transition was actually a geopolitical upgrade. The kingdom moved from being a land that hosted oil production to being a state that could use oil production as policy. Oil becomes power because modern life is built on liquid energy. Factories run on it. Trucks, ships, and planes run on it. Agriculture depends on fuel, fertilizers, and petrochemicals. Militaries depend on it for mobility and logistics. When oil is abundant and cheap, economies feel smooth, growth looks normal. When oil becomes scarce or expensive, the costs ripple through everything: transport, food, manufacturing, and inflation. In that sense, oil isn't just another commodity. It's the bloodstream of industrial civilization. That's why the most important barrel in the world isn't the average barrel, it's the marginal barrel, the one that balances supply and demand. Most consumption and production is relatively predictable. What sets the price is the thin slice at the edge, the extra supply that prevents shortages, or the missing supply that triggers panic. If the market is tight, losing even 1 to 2% of global supply can send prices soaring, because demand can't instantly adjust. Cars don't stop commuting overnight. Airlines can't ground fleets on a whim. Factories can't swap fuel sources in a week. Oil demand is sticky, especially in the short run, and that makes supply disruptions disproportionately powerful. This is where swing producer logic comes in. A swing producer is the actor with enough spare capacity, and enough political discipline, to increase or cut output quickly. They don't have to control all oil. They just need to control the part that matters most, the flexible buffer that stabilizes or destabilizes the market. When you hold that buffer, you don't merely sell oil. You set the conditions under which everyone else operates: consumers, competitors, and even central banks trying to control inflation. So oil becomes power not because it's rare, but because it's essential, hard to replace quickly, and priced at the margin. Control the margin, and you can influence prices, and you can influence economies, and you gain political leverage. That's the hidden ladder from geology to geopolitics. In 1973, the world learned, suddenly and painfully, that oil could be a weapon. In October, the Yom Kippur War erupted when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. The United States rushed military support to Israel, and for Arab oil producers, diplomacy no longer felt like enough. On October 17, 1973, key exporters announced production cuts and an embargo targeting countries seen as backing Israel, most notably the U.S. and the Netherlands. What had been a strategic resource became a strategic lever. Markets reacted like a body deprived of oxygen. Prices didn't merely rise, they jolted. Oil moved from roughly a few dollars a barrel to multiples of that within months, and the shock spread far beyond energy. American drivers faced long lines at gas stations, rationing rules, and the new realization that fuel wasn't guaranteed. In Europe and Japan, the dependence felt even sharper. When the input that powers transport and industry becomes scarce, everything downstream gets more expensive: shipping, food, manufacturing, heating, travel. The macroeconomic fallout was worse than a normal recession. Higher energy costs pushed prices up across the economy while growth slowed. A toxic combination that came to be labeled stagflation, inflation plus stagnation. Central banks struggled because the usual tools worked poorly: tightening money could curb inflation but deepen the slowdown. Easing could support growth but feed rising prices. The oil shock didn't just hit consumers. It rewired policy. And here's the lesson Saudi Arabia absorbed, and the West could no longer ignore: you don't need to conquer territory to change global behavior. If you can tighten supply at the margin, you can force presidents to negotiate, allies to reassess, and entire economies to adjust. Even more striking, producers could sell fewer barrels and still earn more revenue, because price jumped faster than volume fell. From that moment on, oil stopped being just a commodity. It became a geopolitical instrument, one that could reshape alliances, reorder priorities, and remind industrial societies that their prosperity rested on a flow they did not fully control. After 1973, a popular story took off: a secret Petrodollar treaty that forced Saudi Arabia to sell oil only in U.S. dollars. The reality is messier, and more interesting. There wasn't one magical document that chained the global oil trade to the dollar. What emerged instead was a durable bargain built from overlapping deals, incentives, and mutual fear. Washington's problem was simple: it couldn't afford another energy shock. Oil prices were now a national security issue, and the U.S. wanted stability, steady supply, predictable pricing, and fewer surprises from the world's most influential producer. Saudi Arabia's problem was even more existential: it sat in a volatile region, surrounded by rivals and coups, with a military that couldn't guarantee the regime's survival on its own. Money was pouring in, but money doesn't stop missiles. So the relationship hardened into a strategic exchange: security for stability. The U.S. provided weapons, training, intelligence cooperation, and a broader security umbrella. In return, Saudi Arabia kept its ties close to the American-led order and behaved as a key stabilizer in energy markets when it mattered most. Then came the financial loop often called petrodollar recycling. When oil exporters earn huge surpluses, they need deep, safe, liquid places to park that wealth. U.S. financial markets, especially treasury bonds, offered exactly that. Saudi surpluses flowed back into dollar assets, which helped fund U.S. deficits and supported the global role of the dollar. Meanwhile, the oil trade itself naturally favored dollar pricing because the dollar was already the world's most liquid currency. And commodity markets had long used it as a standard unit. In short, the dollar didn't rule because oil required it by law. Oil helped reinforce the dollar because geopolitics, market depth, and security alliances made the dollar the easiest, and safest, default. The system was less like a contract and more like a self-reinforcing machine. By the early 1980s, Saudi Arabia looked like a country that had hacked the rules of economics. Oil money seemed endless, and the state built a social contract that felt like a permanent upgrade: no income tax, free healthcare and education, heavily subsidized fuel and utilities, guaranteed government jobs, and generous public spending that transformed cities almost overnight. For many citizens, the message was clear: loyalty in exchange for comfort and stability. But this model carried a hidden weakness: it was built on a single price chart. Oil revenue is not a salary, it's a cycle. When prices are high, the state can fund everything. When prices fall, the entire system gets stressed at once: budgets, jobs, subsidies, and political legitimacy. That stress arrived fast. In the 1980s, new supply from places like the North Sea and Alaska entered the market while global demand softened. Prices collapsed from the highs of the late 1970s to levels that shattered assumptions. For the first time in decades, Saudi Arabia ran deficits and began burning through reserves. The kingdom that had gone from borrowing to buy food to lending money to the world now had to borrow again, not because it lacked oil, but because its spending commitments were built as if oil would always pay top dollar. Over time, another pressure intensified: demography. The population grew quickly, and a large youth cohort entered the labor market with expectations shaped by the boom years. Government employment, once the default path, couldn't expand forever. Private sector jobs were harder, often lower paid, and frequently filled by cheaper foreign labor. Unemployment and frustration among young people became a quiet structural risk, especially in a region where unrest had already proven contagious. Then came the second jolt. In 2014, oil prices fell sharply again, dropping from triple digits to far lower levels. This time, the warning was unmistakable. With spending patterns locked in and revenue suddenly shrinking, projections showed how quickly even massive reserves could erode. The oil curse wasn't just about corruption or laziness, it was about incentives. When the state can buy social peace with resource rents, reform becomes politically costly. But when the rent declines, reform becomes unavoidable. By 2014, Saudi Arabia understood it was living with a fragile engine, one commodity funding an entire national bargain. When Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, emerged as the kingdom's central decision-maker, he treated Saudi Arabia less like a traditional petrostate and more like a conglomerate facing a shrinking core business. The diagnosis was blunt. A welfare model funded by oil rents could survive only as long as oil stayed high, and the world was clearly moving toward efficiency, electrification, and alternative energy. The famous line fits here: the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. In the same way, the oil age won't end because we run out of oil. It will end because the incentives change. Vision 2030 was framed as that pivot: turn Saudi Arabia from a country that sells crude into a country that invests, builds, and earns across multiple sectors: tourism, logistics, entertainment, advanced industry, and finance. But to execute a pivot this big, MBS needed three things: cash, control, and speed. The first dramatic move came in 2017 at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. Hundreds of princes, tycoons, and senior officials were detained in an anti-corruption campaign that looked, to outsiders, like a corporate takeover inside a royal court. Many were released only after financial settlements that reportedly brought tens of billions back to the state. Supporters saw a long-overdue cleanup. Critics saw a power consolidation. Either way, the economic effect was clear: the center tightened its grip on capital and decision-making. Next came the 2019 Aramco IPO. For decades, Aramco was treated like an untouchable national vault. MBS cracked it open, only slightly, selling a small slice of shares but raising a massive sum. Symbolically, it signaled that even the crown jewel could be used as a funding source for a new national strategy. Then the real engine took center stage: the Public Investment Fund, PIF. Instead of letting oil surpluses sit quietly in conservative assets, PIF became an aggressive global investor, buying stakes, branding influence, and optionality in the industries that might matter after oil. Sports, gaming, technology, infrastructure, Saudi money began showing up everywhere, not just for profit but for positioning. At home, Vision 2030 manifested as spectacle: megaprojects like NOM and the Line, entertainment districts, tourism hubs. Even a desert ski concept meant to announce, we can bend reality. The bet is enormous: build a post-oil economy fast enough to outrun the decline of the old one. The risk is equally large: if projects overrun costs and fail to generate high-quality jobs and durable private sector growth, the kingdom could end up with futuristic monuments, and an economy still dependent on the same barrel of oil. As the global balance shifted, Saudi Arabia started hedging its alliances. For decades the logic was straightforward: the U.S. consumed oil and provided a security umbrella. But the shale revolution reduced America's direct dependence on Gulf crude, while China's energy appetite kept growing. Beijing also brought a different style: less public pressure on governance, more focus on deals. For Riyadh, that opened space to play a two-track strategy: keep Washington close enough for defense cooperation, while moving closer to China for trade, investment, and leverage. Even the mere discussion of settling some energy trade in non-dollar currencies became a signal: Saudi Arabia wants options. Yet the glossy Vision 2030 narrative has a darker underside. Modernization has expanded entertainment and social freedoms in visible ways, but political space has tightened. And high-profile controversies continue to shadow the kingdom's image abroad. And behind many megaproject renderings is a human reality: large-scale construction relies heavily on migrant labor, where oversight, bargaining power, and working conditions have drawn persistent criticism from independent monitors. Power can fund transformation, but it can also hide costs. So the takeaway is not: oil made Saudi Arabia rich. Oil made Saudi Arabia important, and then Saudi Arabia learned how to turn importance into power, first by patiently taking control of Aramco. Then by mastering the swing producer lever, then by wiring its wealth into global finance and security bargains. Vision 2030 is the next test, whether a petrostate can reinvent itself before the old engine weakens. The final lesson is universal: resources don't determine destiny. Control, institutions, and strategy do, and every form of power eventually sends the bill. If you made it this far, you already know oil isn't just fuel, it's leverage. So here's my question: what other, invisible systems, are shaping your life right now? Drop your take in the comments, I read them all. And if you want clear, no-hype breakdowns of power, money, and geopolitics, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This is Global Lens, see the world in full context.